Today's episode is brought to you by DeSanto Propane. DeSanto Propane is 4 generations strong as a trustworthy family-owned business with unmatched customer service. Go online at DeSantoPropane.com for more info or call toll-free at 1-800-752-4574. Since 1937, the difference has been DeSanto Propane. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Debrief Podcast presented by DeSanto Propane. Josh Durso and Jackie Augustine here giving you a preview of Election Day in the Finger Lakes. We're talking contested races, going in depth on our candidate series from the last month, and most importantly, we'll be answering your questions as we go. Jackie, we made it. We are,
oh my goodness,
almost there. Home stretch.
Sure is. And I can tell your voice is a little strained because you have been doing an excellent public service by getting all these interviews, getting all these candidates in here, because how else are people going to know what's at stake and who they should vote for if they don't hear anything from them? So thank you for what you've been doing. I think it's great.
All I can say about it, other than my opinions that I'll share as we go here, is that my voice is cooked. And I just hope I can get through the next hour. So early voting is underway. I kind of want to talk about that quick off the top, because you and I, before we came on here, we were both saying like early voting felt like a really big thing when it first happened, but now it feels like it's kind of slipped into the back. And from the numbers that I've seen up in Monroe County, it doesn't seem like a crazy number of people are turning out to early vote. It seems like maybe early voting access has kind of shifted people back the other way.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess if people are concerned about the weather, you could pick from your non-snowy day to go vote. But I'm a traditionalist. I like to vote on election day. But, I was saying I did vote early the first time it was offered because I just wanted to show a vote of support that I think it's a good idea. Anything that can get more people participating and recognize that not everybody can get there on a Tuesday. But yeah, I'm kind of excited, and I hope that if there's lower turnout for early voting, that means there's going to be a lot more on election day. I hope. However people vote, I just hope they're voting.
Yeah, and it's technically an off election year, right, even though for us on the local scene, it's anything
this is where it is.
Off.
Yeah,
like this is everything.
Yep.
So our first question, and I wanted to get this out of the way off the top because I know a lot of people have wondered. I've gotten some emails. Alex in Canandaigua asked how our election series came to be, how we worked it so that we were able to get as many different candidates as we were able to get into the studio or over Zoom for an interview. And just kind of to pull the curtain back a little bit, in years past, I have tried to reach out to individual candidates in what I would consider to be key races. That usually winds up with like a response rate of, I'd say, 20%, which I think for a lot of some candidates or campaigns are more active on social media. Others more active on email. Some expect you to make a phone call to them. All in all, it's really challenging trying to get to everybody, especially when you consider the fact that we cover a 5-county area. So we've got a lot of real estate to get around. So what I wound up doing this time around with much better results was connect with or send an email to every party leader in every county that we cover. So Republican, Democrat, Conservative, even Libertarian, if I could find contact information for it. Sent invites to all of them in the beginning of September. And within about 3 days, we were getting responses. And all told, we wound up with 49 completed as of this moment. We have one more that'll get us to 50. We'll have 50 interviews with candidates from across our 5-county coverage area. As I said, primarily we're talking about Seneca, Ontario, Cayuga, and Wayne counties. But huge accomplishment. I'm personally very proud of.
You should be.
I'm proud of the volume that we were able to get in about a month. There were some folks who said they weren't notified, or they didn't hear from their respective party people, or they found out through a secondary method. my answer to that was all we can do, or all I can do, is send the email to said party leaders and hope that they disseminate that information. We did it early enough where most seemed really eager to give their candidates the opportunity to get on our platform and get in front of voters and talk about the things that they wanted to talk about. However, I will say I think exposed some of the communication gaps that exist within counties, within parties. So
I think
when you have a county party leader trying to communicate with people running for town offices, when those aren't necessarily high profile county priorities, they even have trouble getting hold of those candidates. So that's kind of the dichotomy of where we were. And, I think all in all turned out as well as it could have. A couple questions came to us more recently about why we weren't, or why I wasn't more specific in the questions that I was asking of candidates. And, I think one of the things we're going to get into this hour is just, I had a real desire this time to zoom out instead of zoom in. Like, I'll use Seneca Falls as an example. The races in Seneca Falls are largely revolving around the landfill.
Mm-hmm.
But there are so many other issues that are really, really important to the future existence of communities like Seneca Falls that I wanted to zoom out, and I wanted to be able to do that enough so that the candidates and voters could really understand where they all stood on bigger issues, housing, other environmental issues, because the landfill in Seneca County or Ontario County is hardly the only environmental issue facing residents. And there's a lot of others too. So that was just kind of the way I approached it. It wasn't perfect, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. And I hope everybody who watched and listened and continues to watch and listen is able to glean a little bit of insight from it and make a better decision on Tuesday, or maybe they already did. I don't know.
No, I think you did a really excellent job. And I think it was important to give the candidates an opportunity to be themselves, because, sitting here, like, there's no space. Like, I don't have any notes. I assume people coming in, like, there's no space to, read something. Unlike sometimes if people are submitting written comments or they're posting to their own social media, they've got time to wordsmith that, to work on it. Not that I'm sure some candidates, they've got their talking points and they rehearse that, but coming in and having a long form interview like that, I think you really get a sense of how people think through an issue, because sometimes your questions might not have been what they were expecting because they weren't maybe the typical talking points that they're getting confronted with if they're going door to door. I don't want to assume everybody is, because not everybody is. But I thought they were really good. I thought they were really informative. I walked away with a feeling that I had a good sense of who the candidates actually are, which is great, because in this election cycle, everybody's got an opinion. Everyone wants to tell you what they think about who. And I think actually being able to see people in action was really a better way of assessing.
From a viewer standpoint, listener standpoint, I'm curious. I felt quite often throughout this process that candidates did not necessarily have the best thought out solutions to problems. They were willing to acknowledge that problems existed, but they didn't necessarily have the solutions thought out. And it feels a bit to me like it's a reflection of where we are right now in community, in society, and culture, where nobody really wants to take that extra step and make it appear as though they're overstepping. They're very quick to candidates. We're very quick this cycle to say, well, I'm really into community input. I really want to get the community's input on the X, Y, and Z things. But it left me feeling at times like candidates were a little squishy. Not to be like, that's a bad way to phrase it, but a little squishy in terms of like, what ideas do you really have? Like, how do you propose we solve housing? How do you propose we solve these different issues on the local level? Did that come through on like listening?
Definitely. Now, I will say I felt like there were some outliers. I felt like there were some candidates who really nailed it, who've like been doing their homework, which is refreshing and exciting. Because if we treat this like a job interview, you want the people that like know the job. But I will say I think of it as like a complaint-based campaign season. So we heard a lot of people saying, well, no one likes this and no one's been addressing this and this is a problem. But like you said, not every candidate was able to say, and this is the way that my particular position in local government is able to move the needle on that. And so here's the thing. You might say, well, some of the people are new. How would they know that yet? I'm not expecting a candidate to come in and say, here is the resolution I'm going to write and do, right? I understand there's a bit of a learning curve, but at least I'm looking for some understanding and acknowledgement and sense of empowerment that here's what's within the domain of local government to solve. Otherwise, why bring it up if there isn't anything you think you can do about it? I mean, if you want to say, well, that's something that has to be handled by the state, then why aren't you following that up with, and as a local city councilor or town board member, I know that the way to get that on the state's agenda is to keep, sending correspondence, asking them to come to meetings, speaking to our state reps. It was like, I think there's the old cliche that politicians are really good at talking a lot and not saying anything. And unfortunately, I think there's a fair share of that coming through this year, but not everybody.
That just triggered a really good example that popped into my head. Housing. When I was talking to candidates in both Geneva and Canandaigua, many hinted that at the hyper-local level, zoning is the fix. However, the actual how we get there in terms of zoning, I felt like most, if not all of the candidates were pretty well lost on that.
Yes.
There were a couple, like you said, that I could tell there was a pretty solid idea there for how they wanted to execute on that, but largely it was missing, and that's definitely not exclusive to Geneva and Canandaigua. When I was talking to candidates in Wayne and Cayuga County, same deal. And I think for a lot of people who are in local politics, they see housing as this big national issue. Like there's a single family housing stock shortage. How do we fix this? Well, you're not going to fix 20 years of supply being missing right now in 2 years or 4 years, right. But there are actual steps that can be taken on at zoning to reverse that trend in shorter order.
Yeah. And I think that for me, when I'm looking at these, I'm thinking, okay, what is this candidate's background? What are they bringing to the table? When they raise an issue where they either claim or have demonstrated to have some experience in this particular area, are they speaking to it with that experience? Is it reflected that they've spent the time in the position they already have, or serving on whatever board or commission they're currently on, learning the ropes? So not to call out anybody in particular, but one of the interviews, like there's a candidate who in Geneva has been on the local development corporation, right? And to hear him talk about issues of housing and code enforcement, et cetera, which in the chartering documents of the local development corporation talk about the gears and mechanisms for addressing that, and not to bring that to bear on the conversation, that's what causes me concern. Like, well, you should know. Well, if you should know that by now. Yeah. So, but before I get critical about anybody, I do want to point out that coming and sitting here took courage, and that those candidates who were willing to actually respond to your request, who have gone to other events, who are actually showing up and doing the work, in my view, deserve top priority over anybody who's non-responsive. Because if you can't even do the work to get the job, it doesn't give me great confidence you're going to do the work on the job.
Every person who sat down there and said, I'm incredibly nervous. I said, this is the least nerve-wracking thing you're going to do in the next 4 years if you're elected.
Oh my goodness, sitting on this
The
chair.
least.
This is a comfortable chair. We've got friendly faces around. It's only going to get worse from here.
So let's get into it. Let's start with we'll tackle Geneva and Canandaigua together. Mark in Geneva wrote, what stood out to you from the Geneva mayoral interviews? It seemed neither of the candidates have shifted much since the primary. And that last part there was a common thread that I received quite a few messages in that same lane of listeners and viewers and readers just not really seeing a huge shift in either of the candidates from the primary. Obviously, Jan Reagan, Steve Valentino, incumbent, they went head-to-head in the primary. We know what happened there. But what do you make of that? What stood out to you?
Well, I guess I wouldn't want a candidate to be shifty, clearly, but I wouldn't necessarily want a candidate to totally change from the primary to the general election, because that would feel like a little bit of bait and switch, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to criticize anybody for being consistent. I guess what did concern me about Steve Valentino's interview is that I felt like there was a lot of criticism lodged at him during the primary that I kind of expected him to address head on in the general election, right? People criticized him for not having good command of counsel, for not getting stuff done, for not really being on the cusp of what Geneva needs and where we need to be going. So I was expecting him to come out after the primary with, his plan for what we need to do and being more responsive to some of those criticisms. But in the answers about economic development and about housing, we're getting the same kind of reciting of the resume of things that he was involved in the past. And it was a little disappointing because I was expecting him to understand that didn't resonate with people during the primary. They want something more. They want to know you're in the game, right? The old hockey Gretzky thing, right? You aren't looking at where the puck is now. You need to know where it's going. Where's the discussion about Micron, about tech? Like, where's the discussion about where Geneva could grow, instead of like, here's how we grew in the past and we just need to find another industry or another something to address that. So I did, to the extent that someone wrote in and said they're not seeing a lot of change, I guess I kind of share that view. And I felt like, given their positioning, it ended up being more disappointing with regard to Steve, because I think people were looking for him to do more.
I guess that maybe is where some of that, maybe that's where some of that is coming from. Maybe some of the people who watched the primary and then lived through this general cycle to this point expected the candidates to come out with more specifics about how that execution portion would look on various issues that, Geneva's facing or going to be dealing with. But, the thing that stood out to me is just how hard that is going to be, or how hard it is to sell anybody on how Geneva is going to approach all of the issues that it has, not knowing what Geneva City Council is going to look like.
Right.
Because I think there's a way, pretty much no matter what combination of candidates wins in next week, I think there's a way that City Council can navigate that and be more effective in the next 4 years than they have been in the last 4 years. That said, I don't think the approach is the same in every one of those scenarios, right?
Yep.
So maybe that's part of the reason that we aren't hearing as in-depth, because that was, I'll be honest, like that was one of the things that I thought was kind of puzzling on Jan Reagan's side was, I really would have expected to see her lay out more of the fine details throughout the latter part of this campaign to drive home that, from her perspective, she is the right candidate. And there's a lot of people in Geneva who seem to agree with that. I would have thought that this latter half of the campaign would have been a good opportunity to drive that point home with fine details, because, this far into the cycle, having already, these two candidates have already gone toe to toe in the primary.
Right.
There isn't any more, gotcha to play. There isn't any more like rocks to throw at the other side. Like it's just, you're to the substance.
Right.
So, but again, one of when I think about that, I put myself in the candidate's shoes, and I think getting that message out is so challenging, and figuring out how to message that, message substance, when it feels like the only thing people pay attention to is the crazy noise.
Yes.
I can understand why candidates approach it the way they do. They're very cautious. They're very careful. And, I think that's kind of what stood out to me from the mayoral race, but I almost feel like I'm a little worn down by it because I went through the primary process. Right. I interviewed both of the candidates, and then I interviewed both of the candidates again. And then I listened to Evan Dawson's interview with the candidates. It was basically a debate, as close to a debate as, Geneva got this year with the mayoral candidates. So
that was an interesting interview. And I was glad that Evan did that because, I think sometimes people think of Connections as a Rochester-based show, but he's been doing a lot to spotlight Ontario County and Geneva in particular issues. And I think he did a great service doing that interview. And I think he brought some things to light that really needed to be discussed and talked about, that it would have been difficult for you to do individually with them because you're only going to see the contrast and the different perspectives when you have them side by side like that, which is why the League of Women Voters debate, a nonpartisan forum, part of Geneva's history. I mean, that's an institution. And, people are saying that this is the first time it hasn't happened. That's not true. It didn't happen when I ran for mayor either. They boycotted that year as well. But, I do think that there is this reluctance to come out and actually hash out the issues in real time. And that causes concern for me because that is what will happen on city council. City council is like a moderated debate. I mean, even when it's well functioning.
Yeah.
And if people aren't willing to engage in that when they've got the safety of an entire ticket alongside them, how are they going to do when they're going to have to interact with people that don't necessarily come from exactly the same background and philosophy that they have? So I think the fact that people aren't participating in some of this stuff should be really cause for concern, regardless of their party affiliation.
And by the way, just as a heads up here, it's a mixed bag of Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and all kinds of people who chose not to participate.
Yep.
No shame. From my perspective, no shame to them. Everybody's got their own schedule. Everybody's got their own thing going on. Gwen in Geneva asked, what are the biggest issues in the city council races? What stands out from the interviews? I'll go first on this one. Civility on city council. And it's kind of mind-boggling to me because it's such a non-issue. City council
should be a non-issue.
Right. Like it is incredible to me the amount of bandwidth that's been spent with candidates just having to say to voters, I'll be nice, or some variation of that. I'll work with other people. Okay, great. That has that, like, grand scheme. City council has been quite functional in the last couple years. Was there a bad stretch in the beginning of COVID? Okay, yeah, we can make that argument. But all in all, city council's worked okay. City council's moved. Has it been a 10 out of 10 on the performance wheel? No. But has it been better than a 5 or a 6? I would say yes. I would say it's been in the last couple years.
We might disagree on that.
Really?
Yeah, we might disagree.
You think so?
On that. I mean, are you talking just about civility or about actual like policy making?
I guess I'm comparing it to the low.
Oh, okay.
I'm comparing it to the low water mark.
But as I tell my kids all the time, better than bad does not good make.
It didn't. Yes.
Yeah, because I mean, I will say one of my main criticisms of the council and one of the real puzzles to me about the guys banding together to run together again as the majority is like, I think you'd want to distance yourself from having had the majority these past couple of years, because there hasn't been movement on housing and infrastructure work and tax, real discussions about like entrenched tax issues and other fiscal issues. And it's not because nobody's raised the issue. It's because there's been a complete inability for council to acknowledge that people they don't like might say things that are correct once in a while. And I think that is the civility issue, you know. So I think I would love to see more evidence of people saying, even if I disagree with someone or I don't like them or I think that their political views are wild or crazy, I am still hearing them and I still understand that what they're saying is reflecting people from the public.
Yeah.
But I brought an example just in case. So case in point, at the last council meeting, a counselor who's not running for reelection, Counselor Burrell, a Democrat, brought up an issue of deer overpopulation in his ward, right? You would think not controversial. And just because here we are in the height of the election and some people need to show that they're not aligned with certain people or whatever, I mean, one of the guys who's running again for reelection just went all in about how he doesn't believe it. He doesn't care about it. And I just thought, okay, we can't have 4 more years of that. That would be disappointing.
That's fair. That's fair.
Now, so you notice I didn't name him. This is not about like trying to shame anybody. It's just the way it is. And I hope it changes.
As far as actual issues go, I don't consider civility to be a real issue.
Okay.
I don't want it to be. I don't want to believe that that's a real policy issue that we need to like press candidates on. I just hope that we can be better in the future and leave it at that.
Yes. Can they all be adults, please?
Yeah.
Could that be our baseline? Yes.
As far as like issues go, what stood out to, like, what was the best policy thing you heard out of the city council candidates? There were a couple things that stood out to me, but I'm curious what ones were kind of like impactful from your perspective, or at least seemed like good ideas at the surface.
I do think, and I do think that this discussion about workforce housing, about the need for accessible, affordable housing for people of a certain age, and I think that again, I don't have notes in front of me, but I'm pretty sure that was both Will and Cassie. I think several candidates brought it up, but in terms of who really had like knowledge about it and seemed to talk about it in a way that seemed like, oh, you've researched this. Oh, you kind of know what other cities have done to address this. Oh, you understand what you would have to do on city council to put us in a position for that. I definitely think that issue, and understanding that there are people who are paying enough rent that they could pay what I pay in a mortgage or what other people pay in a mortgage right now twice over. But they cannot get into the housing market as it is right now, either because there are some limitations in terms of accessing an affordable mortgage with interest rates being what they are now, or with housing prices having jumped, or having had so many properties taken out of commission, either because somebody bought them up and is just sitting on them, or they're being used as an Airbnb, or they're zombie properties. So I felt like that's an issue where I feel pretty confident that we would see some movement if the elections work out a particular way.
Yeah, it was actually, for me, it was what Will said about housing in the city and essentially the affordability crisis that's kind of looming for people in the 20 to 30 something age range. We saw the report a couple months ago. We've talked about it twice now on this show. I asked every single candidate about it. This region is trending in the wrong direction from a population and age demographic standpoint. Cities like Geneva, in the heart of the Finger Lakes, the quote unquote capital of the Finger Lakes, needs to attract young families and young people. And what was really clear to me, talking with him and sitting through that interview is like, he, among with a few others, really understands, I think, the one technical flaw in this tourism-centric economy that we have here. It does not set up well for young people who work in that economy to even be able to afford rent, to live here year round, especially since it is so seasonal and that income will shift based on the season. Forget about owning a home. And I believe he said those exact words. Much of his generation, which he and I are the same age, so it is the same thing. Most of our generation has thrown the towel in on owning a home, and it doesn't even enter the thought. But there are some really concerning rental property statistics, for example, in Geneva and Canandaigua. Over 50%, I believe it was 54% of the residences in the city of Canandaigua are rental properties. Over 50%. One, that's not sustainable for like a tax base, like a tax paying, like you think of homeowners who are going to ultimately be your tax base long term over the next 30 years, 30 plus years. That's not sustainable. And two, you're kind of like slow draining your population because renters are not permanent residents in the way that homeowners are permanent residents.
Right. They certainly have more mobility. And the thing is, I mean, this has been Geneva's challenge. I hate to go back to those studies, neighborhood study and comp plan. No, I don't. I love to go back to those studies. I love those studies. But, this idea that if we don't create a community of choice, we will see the people who have choices move elsewhere. And in this case, we will see people who want to choose to live in Geneva unable to get in. So we have to figure that out, right? We have to make sure there's housing accessibility, but then we also have to make sure that there are other amenities so that once somebody has said Geneva's the place I want to be, and they get into a place that they like, that they want to stay. Because you're right. I mean, a lot of transience in a community is not good long term. But yeah, you did a much better job of remembering what he said and stuff than I did, which makes sense since you did the interview. But yeah, I do remember that answer as being important. And again, the lessons we could learn, we're not the only community in the world, in the country, in the region, in the Northeast, in New York State, that is encountering this issue.
And I will say, every single candidate I talked to from Geneva and Canandaigua acknowledged that, one, aging population, and two, breakdown of where the wealth sits, and the inability for the younger participants in those communities to enter into the community in the same way that they were able to, especially the older generation, is a problem. And it's one that does need to be addressed. So am I confident that they're going to all be able to get to a solution? I'm not sure, because I'm not totally sure what, without diversifying our economy, the region's economy, I'm not sure it's totally achievable.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I guess maybe I don't see it the same way, but I wonder if when some people talk about, like I heard in several of the interviews that, Geneva's losing out population to Canandaigua and Farmington. I thought of that more as the town of Canandaigua, not necessarily the city. The idea being that, the more suburban developments that are kind of going up, that are giving people the opportunity to buy something new, to have something, maybe they're downsizing and they're getting rid of their house and then they're going into an apartment in one of the new developments that's going up. I think that's where I see the tension, that both the city of Canandaigua and the city of Geneva are largely landlocked.
Yeah.
And where and how do we develop new housing units in a way that really meets people's needs? But yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. Are people coming closer to those two population centers? I hope, because generally I think that's a more sustainable way to do things rather than just gobbling up farmland to build more and more sprawl. But yeah, I hope that's what people are getting out of it.
It struck me as odd because when I talked to candidates in Marion, Wayne County, West Bloomfield, Bristol, all three of those candidates that I'm just thinking of off the top of my head felt like they're well positioned to actually help the region deal with some of the housing issues that it has, especially West Bloomfield and Bristol. Now, I don't know that it's necessarily a perfect fit because they're very rural by comparison to, the town of Geneva or, the town of Canandaigua by comparison. But it didn't feel like those people in those communities feel like they're losing out to a place like Geneva or a place like Canandaigua. Where they do feel like they're losing out would be in terms of access to services, which
yes.
Obviously with the clerk's race happening, all of the candidates that I interviewed and spoke with said that was going to be a priority, kind of taking the Monroe County model where mobile office hours,
right.
Maybe they're not necessarily like actually on wheels, but they're going to like town offices or different places in the community where, so for example, you wouldn't necessarily have like a 40-minute drive from Naples to Canandaigua if you want to go to the DMV, or potentially reopening the DMV office in Geneva, which I had no idea was even closed.
Yeah. Yep.
So those types of things, I think that also can kind of help stem that off a bit.
Well, I'd like to think that after COVID, when people had to kind of adapt to remote work, it kind of opened up the possibilities of, maybe we aren't so tied to this one particular location and everybody being in the office, and that's the only way we can deliver services. So I would like to see, I think rural communities do deserve access to services. And I like that idea of like mobile office hours and bringing services out to people, because from coming from Geneva, having to go to Hopewell or to Canandaigua to transact basic business does seem onerous. It doesn't really seem to make sense, and it doesn't really track with the needs of people, especially when they're still going to operate traditional business hours, right? If there aren't going to be extended evening hours or weekend hours, then you're asking people to somehow make that drive after work or before work or on their lunch break. So yeah, I'm glad that that's getting more discussion.
Let's shift and talk a little bit about Seneca Falls.
Okay.
Obviously, I'm not done yet with town supervisor candidate interviews. This will be going up on Thursday. It's November 2nd. I will be interviewing incumbent Mike Ferrara tomorrow, November 3rd. So that will be up over the weekend ahead of Election Day. Already sat down with Frank Schmitter. That interview is online. Rachel writes, will races in Seneca Falls come down to position on the landfill? It seems like the town has a number of other important issues it needs to deal with. Oh boy, that is such a loaded question.
Now, see, I don't think the Seneca Falls election is going to come down to the landfill, because hasn't that been what everyone thinks, including myself, every election to this point? And every time you hear from people, they overwhelmingly are concerned about the landfill, and yet candidates who are somehow aligned with or not totally opposed to, they might phrase it differently, pro-business, even if that business is a landfill, that those candidates still seem to get elected. Now, some people would say that's the undue influence of outside contributions and campaigning. I don't know. I kind of think it's because there are other issues on people's minds that I think this cycle, and through your interviews, we've heard people talk about. I think this is the first time I can remember that candidates for Seneca Falls Town Board were talking in any extended format about Cayuga Nation issues. I mean, what did I miss that in prior elections? Like, I know that had been an issue, but like to really be talking about what that looks like, how that impacts economic development, what that means for the town. I thought that was an interesting and good change, because that's another thing that needs to be talked about.
Yeah. Yeah, I think honestly, to answer the question, it would be a no for me. It's not going to come down to the landfill, because I think, and this isn't even just a Seneca Falls thing. When I think back about Seneca Falls, Cayuga County, Geneva, Canandaigua, flooding
Yes.
was actually the number one infrastructure related to preventing people's basements from flooding and their streets from flooding was the number one issue. And every single one of those, Seneca Falls, Geneva, and Canandaigua, all dealt with their own very significant problems with street flooding and basement flooding and residential flooding in general, brought on by, I don't want to call it extreme weather events, but more frequent heavy rain and extreme weather events. So I think that issue, if I'm just pinpointing one singular issue that has a bigger impact than the landfill, it's how confident do voters feel that candidate A, B, C, and D will be able to manage that problem.
Right. I think that's an excellent point. And I do think that, yes, extreme weather events have brought to the fore the consequence of aging infrastructure and the inability of financially constrained communities to kind of meet their maintenance needs and requirements on an ongoing basis, and to keep up with the volume of water that they're going to have to deal with in the future. So yeah, I definitely think that is a clear issue. I would say, that does tie back to issues of the landfill, because then I think about in Seneca Falls, like the discussion of the installation of the new pipe that was going to go through the sculpture trail a while ago, right?
Yep.
So I think you would want to be looking for a candidate who's going to be able to address the issues without like compromising fundamental values and priorities in the community. So I do think then the landfill comes back into the discussion in that way, that you also don't want to be taking landfill money or incentives for things that are just going to serve the landfill's purposes first and the community's purposes second. So I think that brings it into the mix again. These are all interwoven, complex issues.
Here's what I would say about environmental issues as it relates to water quality, which is ultimately what we're talking about there. If I'm being completely honest and being completely transparent, the issues that Auburn and Cayuga County are dealing with Owasco Lake are far more. Owasco Lake is at basically a tipping point right now. HABs have gotten to a point in that body of water, which I believe provides drinking water to about 45,000 people, where extreme infrastructure, I would describe it as extreme infrastructure measures, are going to need to be taken in the next 5 to 10 years. So much so that the city and the county are now going to the state and essentially demanding that the state step up and use Owasco Lake as more or less an example for all other Finger Lakes to be able to use that playbook going forward. Because even if the landfill is out of the equation, the increasing number of HABs in the Finger Lakes is a huge concern. Cayuga Lake in particular, but it's Seneca Lake, it's Canandaigua Lake, it's every single one of these lakes. And it is a very consequential thing that, because of the energy, and I understand people have a limited bandwidth, right? They have jobs, they have families, they have lives, they have a limited amount of capacity to be able to understand all of these really complicated environmental risks to the region. But harmful algal blooms, cyanobacteria, and frankly, the ag runoff problem that the region has is not one that can either be understated or ignored.
Yep, that's absolutely true.
Because, it seems to get glossed over, but it was about 8 years ago when harmful bacteria showed up in Auburn's actual drinking water, the processed drinking water, 8 years ago. And the HABs problem at Onawasco Lake was a fraction of what it is now. So that is kind of the scenario where, like, these are big, big problems, expensive ones, especially when you think about, so a town like Seneca Falls has to deal with infrastructure to accommodate a landfill, to accommodate extreme weather events, to probably eventually deal with water quality that's so poor that it requires more fixing to become potable in the way that people have been accustomed to. That is a recipe for disaster. If you're not really smart, if your town government or your governing body is not really attentive to those problems and proactive.
And what are you looking for there in your candidates, right? You're looking for candidates that A, are willing to name the problem, B, who are willing to have difficult discussions, even if it involves members of the community and the business community that people depend on, so in the same way with the landfill, there are people who say, the landfill's helping all these community agencies, so they like it. But I mean, think about our agricultural industry, like the wine region, like these are critical tourism industries, but just because our economy depends on them in a certain way doesn't mean we can't be able to speak about and confront the issues related to the operation of those industries. So I do think it is, that's a harder thing to tease out. And that's certainly why I think your interviews are so great and so beneficial for voters, because I think in seeing how somebody responds just in an interview with you might give some sense, some means of evaluation of how could you envision that person having to have that difficult conversation about what needs to be done for the common good, when the person across the table might be somebody that, is pulling a lot of economic weight in the community, or someone that they might not want to offend, or so I think it's good. I think the interview is kind of a test case, giving you a window into how that might go. It's going to take resolve and focus and time. Yeah, definitely.
A couple other quick notes before we get to our last topic here. Public safety, we don't have any huge races other than the DA's race here in Seneca County. It was a little bit surprising to me that the biggest issue that they see is the discovery reform. Obviously, when you listen to the news, when you watch the news, the 5 o'clock news, you hear a lot about bail reform. You hear a lot about that being the big problem in New York State. Discovery reform is actually the biggest problem. It really interesting to listen to both of them, both candidates, talk about how much of a challenge that tight window of time puts on prosecutors and defense, everybody involved, but especially prosecutors in smaller communities that don't have as many resources at their disposal. So discovery reform essentially requires, there's a 2-week window you have from point of arraignment to when all available information has to be available for defense. And because you're relying in some larger cases, you're relying on state labs and a variety of other things. 2 weeks is a heavy lift.
Right.
So that I think is going to be the big, once we get past this election, I think that's going to be the big ticket item that we see DAs prosecutors across the state start to talk to lawmakers and try to lobby lawmakers to shift this in some way, shape, or form to create a little better environment so that cases aren't getting flipped upside down because of some really bizarre timing factors that just aren't really factors. Another one involves the spread of quote unquote rural crisis. I think there's this assumption sometimes that one party or another is the one who likes to say that a certain way of life is going away or is struggling, right? But Democrats, conservatives, and Republicans through my interviews all pointed to rural communities needing better access to services, as is the case with the clerk's race in Ontario County, needing to be prioritized for housing and economic development, as was the case when I talked to legislator Jim Basile in northern Cayuga County. Up in Sterling, it's largely tourism driven in the summer. And then the winter, just kind of like everything dries up completely. And they're very, very, if you've ever been to northern Cayuga County, it's very rural. It's like the center of rural. And it was just interesting because like I said, it was Democrats, it was Republicans. Everybody sees the smallest rural communities in the region struggling. And it's just a matter of how these communities are going to come together to help them all be pulled up together. I'm not really sure how that's going to happen, but it's definitely going to have to be something. Otherwise, we're going to be having a conversation with someone like Supervisor Lynn Chatfield in Wolcott, who straight up said his first words to me in my interview with him was, Wolcott is a poverty level town. That's a tough way to start an interview. Yeah. Last topic, though, I wanted to get into is the delocalization of politics.
Okay.
Because this is something that the more conversation I have with people who are watching local politics, they're not necessarily involved, but they're watching it. One of the very common narratives or themes that I'm seeing pop up are people saying, yeah, I'm seeing more candidates who are concerned about or running for, say, town board or county legislator who are worried about what books are in our schools or worried about what social issues are playing out at the national level. And it's interesting because as I went through afterward and kind of did a little bit of a debriefing on, going to candidates' websites and stuff after I got done doing interviews and such, it was interesting because there are more candidates running this cycle who are, parroting the national issues that we hear that have absolutely nothing to do with any of the things we've talked about. Keeping these communities alive, for example.
Right.
And that to me is a huge red flag. That should be that should set off alarm bells to anybody who's going out to vote on Tuesday or to vote before that. Truly.
Well, it's funny because if you're watching some of the stuff going on in Geneva, they're making these little videos with alarm bells to try to say things that are like you said, these kind of like national scare tactics on local issues. And I'm thinking, hang on a second. This is coming from people who are not going door to door, who are not showing up for candidates night, who are not coming on your show and doing interviews, who have turned down radio requests. Like their only request or pitch to people to vote for them is, I've lived here a long time and I'm not going to let all this national stuff take us over. My current counselor who's running for re-election posted something about how somehow voting for him is like required to keep China out of Geneva. I don't know. Like I couldn't even decipher it. But that is what's happening. It's like, okay, if we don't know the local issues, if we can't point to anything for the incumbents, if we can't point to anything we've done, and we can't really speak about anything we will do because we're not putting in the time, even in the campaign, it's like, well, then we'll talk about, the corruption of the youth by what is accessible in the public library or something. I don't understand it.
Is that people getting lost in the buzz on social media? Because it seems to me that I don't necessarily know how much of that tracks in terms of, so say you post this really inflammatory video or just a post in general, right, and it gets hundreds and hundreds of likes, and it doesn't really have anything to do with the actual issues that people care about in that community. Does it track? Like, does it actually translate to votes? My gut feeling is that it doesn't, but it makes you feel like, it gives you the impression up front that it's having an impact.
I don't think it translates into many votes because I think some people see it as silly. Some people see it as scary. Some people see it as a sign that, oh my goodness, like we don't want council to be dominated by that for 4 more years. Yeah. But I do think that it does seem to appeal to people who are coming to politics, maybe for local politics for the first time, who through getting wound up about national stuff are thinking, well, okay, I can't seem to change stuff at the national level, so I ought to try to overtake the school board or the city council or something. And I just hope in time that that people understand, like, local politics, I think is exciting, but most people think is boring, right? It's about stuff like we were talking about. It's about sewers. It's about zoning. It is about, how your rules and regulations are written for code enforcement. It's about your fine structure. And it's an interesting group of people who want to spend their time on that. But those, you want people who find that interesting and want to work on that. Because if you're only going for the people who are flashy about how they're going to save America through local government, they just don't know where it's at.
Yeah, they don't. Hey, we'll see how things turn out.
We shall see.
5 days away. That'll do it for this edition of The Debrief. We'll be catching up with you guys after Election Day is over and results are settled. In the meantime, follow us on social and check back to the FingerLakes1.com Election Center for all of your election needs in the next week. We'll see you next time.